Hi, and welcome to Rule of Carnage. I'm Glenn Ford, and I'm here talking to Mike Hutchinson about designing better miniatures games. Today, we're going to talk about this fella here, A Billion Suns. We've chatted a little bit about it in the past, but that was prior to it being launched upon the world. And now that it's out in full force in the wild, we thought it'd be good to have a bit more of a chat, maybe take a bit more of a deep dive onto a few of the elements and mechanics that are quite interesting in it. So hopefully now people will have actually played it and might have the book and be able to follow along and understand what we're talking about rather than us ranting away about incredibly brilliant things that we did that nobody can see and nobody understands what we're talking about. So to begin with, what I thought would be fun is to talk a little bit about where Billion Suns originally came from. So I know from my perspective, I remember Mike talking about it to me back at UK Games Expo, I think it was, a couple of years ago. We were sharing a hotel room, and you just said, "Oh, there's a second thing that's been commissioned by Osprey," and then I think maybe it was a year afterwards, and that definitely was when we were going to UK Games Expo. You put out the first version of it on a dinner table for me, and we had a push around of things. I said, "Yeah, there's interesting things there, but there's
Wow, was it that long?
yeah, I definitely remember the first time you showed it to me. It was in my parent-in-law's house where we were staying overnight to visit UKGE, and you said, "Okay, right, this is where it's at now." But I don't know myself the actual original genesis of the where the idea came from. I know there's a lot of high sci-fi references in there and bits and pieces that triggered that in your mind. But I'd like to ask where the original nubbin of an idea for A Billion Suns came from, and possibly if you can talk a little bit about how it got commissioned, how it got picked up, how you opened with the pitching of it.
I've gone to the bottom of my office to the file labeled Mike's Very Old Games. Now, in this folder are all of the things that I created when I was a teenager. That's a role-playing game about being asleep. That's a superhero role-playing game. This is a generic epic battle game called Warfare. Very good. Now, somewhere in here is here they are. Somewhere in here is the hundreds and hundreds of these spaceships that have got
from Smiter Kraken.
So yeah,
that also sounds
these
like
are somewhat ripped off. But so there was a game when we were kids that that I wrote, and yeah, here's the rules. Actually, here's the rules that I wrote for Space Fleet, the incredibly originally titled space game, and it was everything was designed in Microsoft Publisher, and it all has these beautiful little locations with different to hit
Gothic
things.
metal shit.
And there's all kinds of specifics about, like, you don't get any more shield saves if you blow up the shield location, and you've got troop holds because if you bump into each other, of course, the little tokens that are sat on these things can then charge across and invade the others. So I think ultimately and spiritually, like, in the same way that in this folder is Speed Demon, the racing game that I wrote when I was however old, 14, 15. Like, I wrote this in fact, here it is. Here is Speed Demon, the game written for racing orc buggies around. So I think I've always been excited by spaceship games, and that was one of the most complete experiences that I created for my school friends at the time. And I can see ship designs there from John Brindley, who, no surprise, contributed the Eldar ships, and from some other friends at the time. So I think that's the oldest sort of seed of why the next thing that I was excited to do, like the fact that it was the fact that the next thing to get published happened to be spaceships, I think is kind of awesome, and goes back as far as that. If I'm completely honest, the specific thing that happened was for some reason I sometimes get these bugs where I got really into collecting something, and I got really into collecting Star Wars Armada ships, and I think I'd been thinking about spaceship games. I'd been playing a bit of I've been painting up a bit of Drop Fleet Commander, and I got the bug, and I bought these ships, and I put the game on the table, and it wasn't what I was expecting it to be, or rather it wasn't what I was hoping it to be, because it's a relatively skirmish level game. You think it's going to be a fleet level game because it's got these really zoomed out miniatures, but it doesn't like if you put too many miniatures on the table, and it's quite a detailed game with lots of kind of giving of orders and managing little bits and bobs, which is cool and everything, but it wasn't what I was hoping for, which was my memory of a sort of sweeping mass battle space combat game. And so I got the bug for. I was sort of trying to figure out how could you write a really zoomed out sort of strategic level spaceship game. And there's all these notes in my design notebook from around that time where I was trying to figure out, like, could it be a board game? Would it be a hex-based war game, but it would have, like, each hex would represent some massive amount of space, and it would be like, you know, pushing things around with a cue ball, with a croupier's rod. And I think from there I just sort of got into this rhythm of, like, writing slightly different versions of this spaceship game idea, and I didn't really have anything specific in my mind at the time. I was just playing around with lots of ideas, and I think that was about the time when I realized, so that was sort of October, November in 2017, I think. And so because Gaslands was going quite well, I just thought, well, I'll have another pop here. And I wrote something that at the time was called Leviathans, because it sounded cool. And it wasn't really much of a game, but it had a couple of nice ideas right at the center of it. Really, the only one that survived was the combat system with the different dices and the different spreads of hits. But I sort of wrote something that looked vaguely convincing and had sort of Man of War-esque starship outlines and a activation system that had sort of been lifted from Warhammer Quest, the Silver Tower. And sort of, you know, it had lots of interesting ideas in it, but it wasn't anywhere near finished. But I sent that to Osprey and said, hey, I'm working on this capital ship game. Would you like me to pitch it to you? And I caught Phil Smith having just walked out of the new Star Wars movie at that time. He said, I just watched Last Jedi last night, so I'm pro space opera capital ship action right now. So I think at that point I probably panicked and went, oh my goodness, I have to actually write something. And I can see that I got that email on the 19th of December, and I sent him something on the 11th of January, which was quite well sort of expressed, packed out, and there's a, like, PDF version of it and stuff. So I'm pretty sure, I don't completely remember, but I'm pretty sure I didn't have a game on the 19th of December, and then I did when I submitted something on the 11th of January. I think that's how that worked.
Okay, so basically, good luck. I mean, because I think there might be some people who maybe have this image of, you know, Mike Hutchinson on a high from Gaslands could pitch anything to anybody and it would definitely get picked up. And I don't think that that's necessarily super accurate. But
no, in fact, I had a couple of bounces already. That wasn't the first thing I pitched for my second project to Osprey, and it wasn't Osprey wasn't the only people I was pitching to at the time. I was also talking to a couple of other companies.
Was it? Do you think maybe the other things you pitched were even more complete when you pitched them, or were all of them sort of idea shots? Because it sounds like this was a sort of, this might work, and you shot and it landed, and then there was a little bit of an arm waving
I think by this point I'd stopped worrying about developing them too much, because I was starting to get the idea that if I spent 6 months on something and it didn't get accepted, that was 6 months I could have spent on 5 other things, one of which might have got accepted, or you know what I mean.
Yeah, no, totally. And I think this is genuinely probably quite interesting for people, is, how much how developed an idea needs to be and how much you need to have before you start having a pop at pitching it to publishers. Obviously you don't want to sort of scattergun millions of ideas at publishers, because they'll eventually just stop taking your emails. But I think you seem to be suggesting don't write a full sort of 50-page thing and try and pitch that.
I mean, I suppose what I don't know what the balance between having a PDF file, which it's only like 8 pages long, which sort of has something approximating the rules. I don't know whether that was the more important point, or the more important point was the fact that I had like a 200-word abstract that sort of explained what the exciting features of the game were going to be. Many of which didn't make it in. Like, each class of ship has a number of system slots. When building a ship, players must select the tactical systems they will install into each slot. I mean, that's just Gaslands, but like,
absolutely.
It'll probably work like Gaslands, but with spaceships. And then that didn't make it anywhere near the final thing.
Yeah, no, totally. And funnily enough, one of the things I'd like to talk about later on is why some of the things like that didn't make it in didn't. But I think, you mentioned earlier on the silhouette system for the ships and the different dice for the weapons. As I remember it, that was one of the things that was there very early on and made it all the way through. There were a couple of slight tweaks, I think, to the dice ranges. We'll talk about that in a second. I did. This is something that totally came from you. It's there from the start, and I honestly think it's one of my absolute favorite things in A Billion Suns. I think the silhouette system is ridiculously elegant and sort of particularly beautiful for people who haven't yet picked A Billion Suns up. It's a fairly simple system where each ship has a silhouette. I suppose the outline of the ship. The bigger your ship is, the higher the number of the silhouette. So the tiny recon ships have a silhouette of 1, and the massive capital ships have a silhouette of like 10 or something. The guns, the lasers that are fired in A Billion Suns, roll D6, D8, D12s, and so on, meaning that a large ship carrying a big gun that does a lot of damage has a very low chance of hitting a very, very small ship, because they've got to get a 1 on a D12, which is a lower chance of getting a 1 on a D6, whereas the smaller ships have a almost certain chance of hitting the larger ships, but a lower chance of wounding them. And that's something that, saying it like that, it sounds a little bit complex, but in the game, I genuinely think it's one of the most elegant solutions for evening out, making all the choices interesting, and one of the most elegant solutions for needing different sorts of troops on the battlefield, as it were, because sure enough, the massive Star Destroyer will obliterate the X-Wing if it hits it, but it won't hit it because it's dodging around and so nippy. What inspired that originally? Was it a mechanical thing first? Was there because it's a very thematic rule, but a very mechanically elegant rule. Do you remember what sort of made you start putting it together first, or where it came from?
So it's odd, actually. So the way that it emerged was, so I started with these sort of cards that I was imagining you would, like a car dashboard card in Gaslands, I was imagining you would have these little cards in front of you. So you'd have one for each capital ship, and maybe a squadron would have its own card with multiple ships on it. And then just exactly like Man of War, like the ship would then be divided up into these sections, and then the dice that you needed to roll would tell you where you'd hit, and so that would tell you, you know, what the saving throw was or what critical damage was going to happen. And as I was drawing these cards, you know, I was naturally drawing, because I was just copying Man of War, I was naturally drawing these big capital ships that had like 5 or 6 hit locations, and I was drawing these little sort of corvettes and whatnot that had like maybe 2 or 3 hit locations. And from that kind of graphical exploration of like, what are ships like to divide up into hit locations, that's where this dice mechanic came from, because I was literally drawing the silhouettes on a piece of paper and then literally carving them up into hit numbers. And so I guess that just made me realize, okay, so I could put different to hit numbers on each of these locations. And actually, maybe if I don't put, rather than spreading out a D6 across 5 locations versus 3 locations, if I just run out of numbers and say, oh, you can't actually hit with a 5 or a 6. And that's when the light went on.
And where the idea of coming in with the multiple different dice for the different weapon systems, because I think that's one of the things that's particularly smart about it, is that the bigger dice that does more damage is harder to hit with, because obviously fewer of its faces will hit the smaller ships. Do you remember where that clicked in?
I'm not sure, but I think like once I got that light bulb switched on, then I hit my notebook for like a week, sort of turning that idea over and round and over and round. I mean, I know for certain the last thing that I played with that kind of funny dice thing was the Savage Worlds role-playing game. So maybe that was in my vaguely recent memory, because I've been playing Gaslands using the Savage Worlds thing. So that's possibly where it was turning over from. But like at the point when I'd got something interesting, I just took that mechanic and I turned it over and over and over, and looking for lots of different ways of maybe attacking that. But I think what happened was, once I realized that the dice, the to hit numbers meant something, I started to wonder like whether a dice pool was the right mechanic. And so I started messing about with like, am I just using one dice or am I using multiple dice? And we probably won't get into it this time, but like rolling pools of dice ended up being a kind of bit of a design challenge to get through before the end of it. But yes, I'm not sure. I think that one just came from you know, hammering at the forge.
I mean, you're mentioning there about there was a period where there was more dice mixing in the shooting. There was not wildly pleasant phase wherein you had to calculate a wide range of different dices that you had to figure out that was going into the shooting, and then you would roll d8s and d12s and d20s all in the same thing, and it looked like it was going to be sort of spectacular because you were holding masses of different dice, and it ended up being a sort of mathematical just pain train to put people through. And there was an idea of stripping, and I think one of the things that was interesting about that particularly is it was around the same time where I seem to remember there was a point in the design where a lot of the shots got saved as well. And there were a lot of games around that period of the playtesting where a shooting phase involved careful calculation of picking up all these different dice from all these, you know, different dice boxes, rolling them all, going through some head scratching of like, okay, well, this one hits at this sort of power, so I need another dice to represent the additional hit for it. And then you rolling your saves and saving them all, and just being just pain going through this sort of incredibly long,
literally 0 game state chain.
This extremely baroque process, at the end of which you did like 1 wound, and you were just, please stop making me go through this. Please stop sort of visiting it upon me. And I suppose 2 things in relation to that, and I'm constantly fascinated about the the line for when saving throws are exciting and when they're boring. And I
Mm.
honestly think we could almost do a whole podcast on that. But because there's a thing where it's like if you roll the dice and you get all of your saves repeatedly, it's dull. The game becomes the dullest thing in the world. But if you really need to make a bunch of saves and you make the bunch of saves once, it's one of the most exciting parts of the game. So I mean,
And if you take them out entirely, there's just this real like being slapped from afar sort of emotional sensation of like, I rolled some dice, now you have to take your toys off the table. And you're like, doesn't feel very good.
yeah, it's a weird thing. It because it felt. I think was there a point where there weren't. I think there was a point where there weren't saves, and there were way too many saves. And then I think we sort of got to the right place now. I seem to remember there was a point where there was no saves, and it is weird because it feels like you shouldn't need saving throws. It feels like it's a slightly arbitrary thing that happens at the end of an attack phase to just make the person who's being battered feel like they're having some engagement. But it really does it did change the flavor of things, sort of going back and forth on that. Why do you think, given given that generally, I guess, saving throws are it's just an extra coin flip at the end of a sort of a round. It's not like you have a massive amount of control over it. Why do you think that's important? A, B, why aren't there saving throws in Gaslands then? C,
There absolutely are.
oh, there's the dodge saves, aren't there?
There's the 6 dodge save, which is kind of the point of it. It's like it's perfunctory in Gaslands,
Mm,
but that's sort of like that's the somebody described it to me very succinctly as there are 2 players in a game, and so if you're engaging in some combat, then whether it's cinematic or emotional or what or like just a sense of fairness or something, as long as you both have something to say in the exchange, whether that's a close combat or a firefight, there just seems to be a better tabletop experience if you've both had something to say about that. And so in Gaslands, the saving throw is extremely perfunctory because I want that game to be really explodey, and so the amount of hits that you generate from dice compared to the number of saves you generate is like wildly imbalanced. And there is a mechanic which in my mind is good because the faster you go, the more saving dice you get. But in reality, you barely ever get any saving throws regardless of how fast you're going, because those 2 mechanics aren't quite locked together. And so in A Billion Suns, the saving throw mechanic was much more important because it was the final cog that locked the combat system together. So we have silhouettes so that small ships have got smaller ranges of to hit numbers, and larger ships have got larger ranges, and it's really visual. And then you've got the different dice shape, which mean, as you say, it's oddly, appropriately enough, easier to hit a small ship with a small gun and easier to hit a large ship with a large gun. And then the missing piece was, okay, well, how do you get saving throws to interact interestingly with this system? And so the answer was, well, if you use the same dice, but and then force people to make a saving throw against a number, then somebody that's got a really big saving throw number, like a 7 or an 8, like they can nail that saving throw on lots of the dice with a pretty convincing regularity, except the biggest dice where you've got the strongest weapons which can punch through the shields. And so even if I've got a saving throw of 6 or 7, like still quite likely I'm going to fail my saves against a D12. So that like represents that sort of tearing power. And I think that saving throw was essential to finish the story of this combat system. But I think in general they're essential because there are 2 players and both of them want to say something about it, even if it's perfunctory.
Now I remember the what became the donuts being in there from the get-go, and I think that was something that you were keen on. It feels to me like you were keen on that as for for a narrative reason. The idea of little ships nipping in to the sort of the dead zones in between the larger ships. Is
Yeah.
However, I don't remember there always having been passive fire in the game. I think that was something that sort of got developed as it went on.
Yep, that's absolutely right.
Now, I think it's interesting because I guess presumably, this is why we sort of talked about doing it. The donuts, I don't think worked the way that they were meant to without the pacifier being part of it. It feels like the donut range without the pacifier just meant that ships were all staggered across various tables, and everyone just went to their happy zone and then sort of blatted at people. Whereas the pacifier donuts meant that there's this geometry puzzle of, okay, I've got to get within his pacifier donut, but get him in my primary attack donut, and finding that zonal control on the tabletop. I think there was something that took quite a bit of finessing and fiddling with and cajoling to come in. Where do you remember the bits of that puzzle falling in, and why was donuts there from the very first thing? What was the sort of inspiration for that idea?
I mean, definitely this is all it's all coming out of the same idea of, you've got these big lumbering guns, and then you've got bristling turbo laser batteries all over the capital ships, and the cinematic image of, like, starfighters battling, TIE fighters and X-wings battling across the skin of some giant Star Destroyer. And so there's a bit of laser fire going on from the Star Destroyer, but, like, the capital ships are slugging it out at range, and then the sort of fighters are fighting it out kind of under the mother's wing. Like, that was what the Rangers were trying to achieve, which is, if you've got a big stonking gun, then you can't shoot anything within 8 inches, because that's telling the wrong story. You're not going to point your massive, like, takes half an hour to warm up mega railgun or whatever. But I mean, I think that looking at the original rules from right at the very beginning, there was always the idea of auxiliary that had little local bubbles, and sort of the bigger guns that had these bigger ones. So I think that really, rather than passive fire, like, pacifier was just sort of something that always needed to be there. We just hadn't mined down to the diamond yet. It was always sitting there ready to come out, because you had these little weapons that could do things more nimbly, and the pacifier just sort of, it evokes that. The pacifier rule being that you can shoot whenever somebody lands next to you just gives you this kind of nimble, small arms. Like, sure, they're not very powerful, but you can shoot 100 pulses a second with them or whatever. So it continues to tell the story of what the weapon type is like.
Yeah, and I think
I think it's very narrative in that regard.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting system in that it's very narrative, in that you can picture ships dodging inside and outside of these sort of laser fields, whilst it's quite central to a lot of the mechanical strategy of the game, because obviously that's what gives the movement phase its meaning. That's what gives a lot of the zonal control, because it's a game that's a lot about zone control, and you gain a lot of that from pacifier. Again, for people who haven't picked up A Billion Suns yet, a lot of the weapons in A Billion Suns, I think all the weapons in A Billion Suns, have minimum and maximum ranges, and some of the weapons are primary weapons that you fire during your turn. The others are passive weapons that you fire when somebody else moves into the correct range for them. And so that's where we're talking about the donut ranges of the various ships, and the passive and active abilities of the ships. So the last thing I'd like to talk about, sort of in this part before we break from the conversation, is, again, now this is something that was there and that it wasn't there, if you see what I mean, from the earliest version of the game I remember. and that's that there are no set army lists or lists of any kind really in A Billion Suns. Now, obviously, I remember that always being there from the start. I don't know if it was a conscious thing that you were wanting to be the case from the start, or something that you hadn't yet gotten around to writing was a forced construction system. Because again, you know, if you're not familiar with Billion Suns, at the start of A Billion Suns, you have no ships, you have nothing whatsoever. You pay the price for a ship, you go into debt, and then you're allowed to jump that ship onto the table. So at the table, as the game evolves and generates itself, you decide what ships you need to get the job done, and then the game can escalate, because the more points that your opponents spend on ships, the more points you can afford to spend on ships, because you're only trying to come out ahead of them in profit rather than necessarily come out in the black. So yeah, it was that something that was always intentional, or was that something that you think sort of where the genesis was partway through, or?
Well, no, so this one's quite specific. So the 19th of the 11th of January manuscript that I submitted, I said what the chapter list was going to be. In chapter 14, I can see here it's going to be the factions. So because everything that you've said there about how Billion Suns handles, like, there's no armies and you jump them in, none of that was there, or even a twinkling in my eye when I started writing the game. That emerged as I was trying to figure out how to solve the jumping in, like, surprise, there's a Star Destroyer problem work. And actually I can see Phil Smith saying that although he can't wait to see what the factions are, something that's not often seen in these kinds of games would be a system for building your own faction on top of the pre-generated ones. So that you can kind of create some homebrew factions. Because for the Blue Book series, the Osprey War Game series, the sort of build your own faction idea has been quite, like, that's been something that they've sort of agitated for and has worked out quite nicely for them, because they're miniature agnostic. Like, it's supposed to be relatively light on convincing you to buy a certain range of or type of miniatures. And to be honest with you, we'd just come out of the experience of writing the faction system for Gaslands, and I'd been sort of, I was like a born again faction convert at that point. I could see why it was so lovely to try and write within a faction system. And so I don't know, I guess I kind of sort of half rolled my eyes and half went sort of, okay, this sounds like a crazy challenge. Let's sort of take that one on. And although it took a long time for that faction, build your own faction system, to actually end up hitting the workbench, I think that it ended up forcing my initial, like, normally I would write a game with a very light faction flavor anyway, because I'm trying to get the mechanics working. And I think in my mind I was always like, well, everything's going to start off being generic and then we'll have a faction system to customize it later, rather than starting from a world where goblins are tiny and elves are really tall and lanky and they play just fundamentally differently. And I think that's probably what gave the space in the design for Everybody Jumps Something In, because Everybody Jumps Something In is just about cognitively digestible if everybody's got the same a la carte menu, because then you can read the other person's situation without having to, like, know everything and calculate everything on two sides of the table, or, you know, heaven forfend, four sides of the table if you're playing multiplayer. So I think that the idea of having a faction system that you would build your own ended up leading to a lot of good stuff, because I sort of parked it in the future and used that space for other things.
Yeah, I think the fact that there aren't traditional factions in A Billion Suns really at all. It's interesting. It's interesting that it's interesting to have a game where everybody has the same set of options, the same menus, you know, but that something develops out of that on each time you play, because there are so many cogs that, you know, working in any given single game of A Billion Suns. I think that
the thing is though, with the faction system in A Billion Suns, or the build your own faction system, I sort of cheated because I was still very much a born again faction convert. And there are other games in the Osprey War Games line, like of Gods of Mortals and the sci-fi skirmish one. What's that one called? Oh bother!
Scrappers.
Say again.
Is it Scrappers?
No, Rogue Stars. Actually, I think Scrappers is like this. Is possibly no. I think Scrappers might have a proper faction system in it, where you get like a big list of options, and so you can build a very flavorful crew from those options. And the thing that it doesn't do, which faction systems do, is force you down one path or another. So as you start choosing some options, other ones close off from you. And so that's why the tech tree system exists in A Billion Suns. And so it's sort of a tiny bit of a cop out, or not a cop out, but it's different to the build your own factions in the other games because it's not as open as all that turns out. Not cool. Everybody has access to everything, I suppose.
Cool. So we'll take a little break here. We're not sort of going off and talking about two different subjects in this particular conversation. But we are going to take a short break and come back again and talk about Billion Suns a little bit more. So wherever you found this, there will be comments. Please let us know what you think and what you'd like to talk about in the future. Since you're watching this as video, it is also available as a podcast for long painting sessions. Either way, reach out to us on Twitter or any other social media. For now and until next time, it's goodbye for now. Bye-bye.
Bye.